人心臓でざんすね。しかも娘子。
男のマガジン。
In my last video, we covered stories about flying heads that the Iroquois nation used to encounter. And strangely enough, they're not the only people who have legends about flying heads. The Japanese and the Chinese have ancient stories about people, or in some cases whole tribes of people, whose necks can stretch out of their bodies so they could stalk and attack their prey, or just to see who's at their front door. It is also believed that their heads could detach from their body and fly on its own, just like the stories from the Native Americans. Now these beings are known as the roko, and since I can't pronounce that correctly, I'll just call them shapeshifters, as they are believed to be shapeshifters. In some stories, they're even known as vampires, as they suck the blood from their victims. Now these shapeshifters do their best to hide from us. They don't want us to know they exist. In the day they appear as hardworking normal people, but at night they transform into something terrifying. Some of the earliest writings of these shapeshifters go back for thousands of years. It is believed that the first documented encounters with flying heads and these long-necked humans happened in ancient China. Then, over time, they made their way into Japan. In 1712, a Japanese doctor wrote a book, an encyclopedia, about all the known paranormal creatures. And in this encyclopedia, this doctor wrote about a paper that he found from the 1600s. This paper, called The Free Realms, had text that talked about flying heads that happened in ancient China around 200 BC. So these stories of flying heads go back for thousands of years. And what I thought was interesting is a Native American stated that the first sighting of flying heads that happened here in America happened to a tribe whose name had been lost to time. So this tribe must have been ancient, as their name was no longer remembered. So could these sightings that happened in China and America have happened around the same time? And what blows my mind is how the Native Americans and the Chinese both have stories about flying heads. Two ancient civilizations who had no contact with each other. So it makes me wonder, what if in the ancient past, these flying head creatures did exist? Now, according to the paper The Free Realms, 2,000 years ago the Chinese would encounter people whose heads at night would fully detach from their bodies. Their ears would flap like wings, and their heads would fly around and eat insects. And before dawn, they would fly back to their bodies and become normal-looking humans again. Some Chinese at the time believed that maybe these humans were cursed because of their sins. Others suggested that maybe these shapeshifters didn't even know they were shapeshifters, kind of like they were possessed. After they would fall asleep, their heads would detach from their bodies and fly around the countryside. And from time to time, people would see these heads just flying around, and they would be terrified. Now, as time went on, people started to believe that these shapeshifters were actually evil non-human entities. They were more like vampires. After the sun would go down, their flying heads would stalk and kill humans so they could suck their blood and even eat their flesh. There's one famous story about a samurai who decided to put down his sword and become a traveling priest. And on one of his travels, he stopped to stay with a family of woodcutters who lived in a remote area. And one night, after a long praying session, he got up to get some water. And when he passed by the woodcutter's family room, he saw that their heads were missing, even the children's. Now there was no blood on the floor or any sign of a struggle, but their heads were just gone. So this priest, terrified, went outside to go get some help. But then he saw their heads flying in the garden, and their heads were eating insects. Now while he was watching in complete horror, hiding behind some bushes, he overheard them talking about eating him. Now this priest was freaking out, he was scared to death. But then he remembered hearing stories on his travels about these shapeshifters, and he remembered that if you hid their bodies while their heads were detached, they would become frantic and confused, and shortly after they would die. So this priest ran back into the house as fast as he could, grabbed each of their bodies and hid them one by one. Then he went back to his hiding spot, and he saw that they were still just flying around, eating insects and talking to each other. But then, something rather bizarre started to happen. He saw that their heads did start to get confused, and then one by one they slammed into the ground and just died. Now this priest felt that he was one of the rare lucky ones who had come face to face with these creatures and lived to tell the tale. Another possible encounter with these shapeshifters happened when two travelers entered into a small town. While these two travelers were walking down the streets of this beautiful town, they were pleasantly surprised at how nice and helpful the locals were. But they soon realized that something was just off about these people. They seemed a little bit too nice. And every one of them was wearing a scarf that not only covered their neck, but also their lower jawbone. And this really freaked these two travelers out. So instead of staying the night, they decided to leave. And later they realized that these people might have been shapeshifters. And the reason they were being so nice is because they wanted them to stay the night so they can have them for dinner. Now for hundreds, if not thousands of years, there have been many alleged encounters with these shapeshifters. But these shapeshifters are not all the same. Some of them have long necks that can stretch extremely far out of their bodies. Others have heads that can detach from their necks and just fly around. Some can stretch out their arms or legs. Travelers have claimed that while out exploring Japan, they would encounter what seemed to be normal-looking human beings. But while they were looking or talking to them, their whole upper bodies stretched out to the point that they were now towering over them, and these travelers were scared to death. Now Japan is a country with very rich folklore. There are many stories that have been passed down for centuries about people coming face to face with monsters. And I have made videos about some of them, but there are so many more that I just can't wait to cover. Until next time, this is Paranormal Junkie. Make sure to subscribe and stay tuned.